maybe got detained or something. So that's serious.
Their choices, and I'm gonna, oh, yeah, let me sit here. Yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Small Grains Annual Summary and Grain Stocks Briefing. My name is Lance Honig and I serve as Chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board, NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're very pleased to have Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist, joining us as Secretary Designate today. Seth, I'd also like to share that we do have some visitors with us today. That's right on that side of the room for you. These are some members of the Interagency Council on Statistical Policy Mentoring Program. So welcome to all of you once again. Before I turn things over to our presenter, I do have a few notes for our live streaming audience. These reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 30 minutes of their release. Therefore, we will not be taking questions from the public during this briefing. NASS staff are available for phone or email questions, and NASS will host a social media event at 1:30 Eastern Time today. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Anthony Perlman. He is the acting chief of the NASS branch. Anthony.
All right, well, thank you, Lance, and good afternoon. I too want to welcome those who are joining us here today, as well as those who are joining online. So I have a lot of information to go over today, so let's go ahead and just jump right into it. I first want to make you aware that today's grain stocks report includes this special note on the front page reminding data users of our procedure for reviewing the corn and soybean balance sheets at the end of the marketing season. Now, the timing of this review is nothing new, but we wanted to make folks aware of it. Now, based on this review, 2024 corn production was revised up 25 million bushels, and 2024 soybean production was raised 7.74 million bushels compared with the previous estimates, and we'll talk about these changes more later in the briefing. Now, as we normally do, let's first look at the multiple data sources that we use to establish the estimates in today's report. We'll start by looking at the two operator-reported surveys we conducted. The first is our September agricultural survey, which is a farmer-reported survey. Now, the sample size was just over 55,700 with data collection running from August 30th through September 16th. Now, for this survey, farmers are asked to report the total acres they operate, as well as acreage, yield, and production data for the small grains they produced, and the amount of grain they had stored on their farming operation as of September 1st. Now, the other survey we conducted is the all-farm grain stock survey, which accounts for all grain stored in commercial facilities. There are approximately 7,900 of those facilities across the country, and we collected data from them between August 31st and September 18th. Now, as a reminder, throughout the growing season, we have also conducted our winter wheat objective yield survey in the 10 program states. This past year, we surveyed 1,155 winter wheat fields. Once harvest began, our enumerators monitored their assigned fields to make sure they made one final visit to that sample field to take counts and clip heads before that field was harvested. And information from that final visit is used in combination with the farmer reported data to help us establish the final yield estimates for the season. Now, in addition to the survey work, we also utilized administrative data from both FSA and RMA to determine if we needed to revise our previous planted and harvested acreage estimates for the crops that are included in today's reports. Now, this map shows how those September agricultural survey samples we discussed on the previous slide are distributed across the U.S. As you can see, the larger sample sizes represented by the darker shade of orange are in the nation's major row crop and small grain producing states. All right, let's go ahead and dive into the data, starting with winter wheat. Planted acreage at 33.2 million acres was lowered 0.2% or 62,000 acres compared to the previous estimate back in August and is down 1.1% from last year. Harvested area is estimated at 25.5 million acres. That is up 3.1% or 773,000 acres from the previous forecast, but down 2.7% from last season. Average yield for 2025 is estimated at 54.9 bushels per acre. That's up 0.2% or just 1/10 of a bushel from our previous forecast and up 6.2% or 3.2 bushels from the previous year. I do want to point out this represents the second highest yield on record for the U.S., only behind the 2006 yield of 55.3 bushels per acre. Production for 2025 is estimated at 1.4 billion bushels. That is up 3.4% from the previous forecast and up 3.5% from 2024. And then lastly, the bottom table on this slide shows the top 5 winter wheat producing states in 2025 and how acreage, yield, and production compare to last season. Now, looking at winter wheat acres across time, you can see how this year's planted and harvested estimates compare to the previous 9 seasons. All right, this is how the 2025 average yield of 54.9 bushels per acre compares to previous years with the trend line plotted. Now, as you can see, it represents the 3rd consecutive year of increasing yields and did come in above trend. All right, now let's look at the 2025 winter wheat yield by state compared to the previous forecast we published back in August. Now, as a reminder on this map, the top number in each state represents the state's 2025 average winter wheat yield. The bottom number represents the percent change from the August forecast. States colored in blue are showing an increase from the previous forecast, whereas states colored in red are showing a decrease. And then the darker the shade, the greater the percent change. Now, states colored gray are unchanged from the previous estimate. And you'll also notice there are several states with no color and no calculated percent change, but do show a yield. These are our annual estimating states. So we did not make a forecast back in August, but we did want to include them on this map since they do have a 2025 average yield published for them. Anytime you see a pound sign beside the top number, that represents a record high for that particular state. We had several of those this past year, including in Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, South Carolina, and Texas. Now, this map is also showing the 2025 average winter wheat yield by state, but now we are comparing that to the 2024 average so that you can see the year-over-year changes. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of blue in the lower part of the country, indicating better yields this year compared to 2024, but lower yields were reported in the northern portions of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, as well as the Northeast. All right, this next slide provides some information from our winter wheat objective yield survey that I mentioned earlier. As a reminder, the vertical blue bars on the chart represents the number of heads per square foot as measured by the survey. The red dot represents the yield forecast for the 10-state region that we conduct the objective yield survey in. Now, as you can see in this graphic, the final heads per square foot at 46.7 is just slightly higher than what we reported back in August, and it represents the highest head count since 2016. Now, looking at winter wheat production over the last 10 seasons, you can see that this year's production of 1.4 billion bushels is the highest since 2016. All right, let's now look at how today's winter wheat production estimate compares to pre-report industry expectations. Now, each blue dot on this chart represents an individual industry member's published expectation of winter wheat production. The red square represents the NASS production estimate of 1.4 billion bushels. And then, as you can see, the NASS estimate came in above the range of expectations, so it probably will be somewhat of a surprise today. All right, let's switch gears and now take a look at other spring wheat. Planted acreage at 9.99 million acres is unchanged from the August estimate, but is down 6.4% compared to 2024. Harvested area is estimated at 9.61 million acres. That is down 0.8% or 80,000 acres from the previous forecast and down 7.5% from last season. Now, the average yield for 2025 is estimated at 51.7 bushels per acre. That is up 3.4% or 1.7 bushels from our previous forecast, but down 1.3% or 7/10 of a bushel from the previous year. And then production for 2025 is estimated at nearly 497 million bushels. That is up 2.5% from the previous forecast, but down 8.7% from last season. Now, looking at this year's acreage numbers compared to the previous 9 seasons, you can see they are the lowest in this data series and continue the overall decline we have seen going back to 2018. Now, as we have mentioned throughout this year, this represents the lowest planted and harvested area since 1970. Now, looking at how the 2025 average other spring wheat yield compared to previous seasons and trend, you can see it is down from last year, but it does represent the second highest yield on record, only behind last year, and it is above trend. All right, comparing the final other spring wheat yield estimate to the previous forecast by state, you can see the biggest increases in Montana, which is up 4 bushels from the August forecast, in South Dakota, which is up 5 bushels. You also notice that we are estimating a record high yield in Minnesota this year. And then real quickly, this map just shows the year-over-year changes in yield by state. All right, this is how today's production estimate of 497 million bushels compares to the previous 9 seasons. All right, in terms of how today's other spring wheat production estimate compares to industry expectations, you can see that it is within the range, maybe a little bit higher than some had anticipated. All right, next we'll look at durum wheat. Planted acreage at nearly 2.19 million acres was lower just 1,000 acres compared to our previous estimate, but is 5.9% more than what was planted in 2024. Harvested area is estimated at 2.12 million acres. That is down 0.7% or 16,000 acres from the previous forecast, but 4.3% higher than last season. Now, the average yield for 2025 is estimated at 40.6 bushels per acre. That is down 0.7% or just 0.3 of a bushel from the previous forecast, but up 3.3% or 1.3 bushels from the previous year. And then production for 2025 is estimated at 86.2 million bushels. That is down 1.4% from the previous forecast, but 7.7% more than what produced last season. All right, looking at durum acreage across time, you can see this is the 3rd consecutive year of increased acreage and is closer to where acreage was prior to 2019. And this is how the 2025 average durum yield compares to the previous 30 years and trend. Now, comparing the 2025 yield estimates to the previous forecast by state, you can see that the 2 largest durum wheat producing states of North Dakota and Montana moved in different directions compared to their August forecast. Montana's average yield is 3 bushels higher than what producers reported in August, while North Dakota is actually down 3 bushels from their August forecast. And as you can see, there is a pound sign beside the Arizona and California yields, indicating those are record highs for those 2 states. And then here's a quick look at how this year's yield compares to last year by state. Now, looking at durum wheat production over the last 10 seasons, you can see that the 2025 production of 86.2 million bushels is the highest since 2016. All right, today's durum production number should not be much of a surprise since it falls within the range of expectations. All right, this next table just shows the other crops included in today's small grain annual summary. Starting with barley, planted area was raised less than 1% from the August estimate, but harvested was lowered 2.8%. I do want to point out that the harvested number represents the lowest harvested acres in the U.S. since 1875. Now, we are estimating a record high barley yield for 2025 at 80 bushels per acre. Now, this is up 2.7% from the August forecast and up 4.4% from last year. Production is estimated at nearly 141 million bushels. That is down 2.5% from 2024. Now, moving on to oats, both planted and harvested area was raised from the previous estimate, and both are up from last year. Yield at 73.8 bushels per acre is down 3.1% or 2.4 bushels from the previous forecast and down 3.4% from the previous season. Production is estimated at 69.6 million bushels. That is up 1.9% from 2024 and the highest U.S. production since 2015. And then planted rye acres at 2.23 million are up 1% from last year, while harvested acres per grain are down 15.2%. However, keep in mind that much of the planted area for this crop is used as either a cover crop or feed, so it's not surprising to see planted and harvested area moving in different directions year over year. A yield at 36.5 bushels per acre is down 0.3% from the previous season, while production is down 15.4%. All right, before we move on to looking at the stock estimates, let's take a look at the percent of acres remaining to be harvested at the time we did our survey. Now, this information does not come from our weekly crop progress report, but instead is based on the number of acres remaining to be harvested for grain or seed as reported by the producers when they completed their survey. Now, the percent of acres remaining to be harvested in 2025 is represented by that gold bar on this chart. And as you can see, except for durum, the amount left to be harvested for the other crops on this chart is lower than the previous 3 seasons. And even for durum, it's in line with 2022 and actually lower than what it was in 2023. So no major issues with the small grain harvest this year. All right, let's now transition over to the stock estimates we released today, starting with all wheat stocks. Now, as a reminder, September represents the first quarter or beginning stocks quarter of the marketing year for wheat and the other small grains. As of September 1st, all wheat stocks total 2.12 billion bushels. That is up 6.4% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks are up 4.3% year over year, while the off-farm portion is up 7.5%. Now, this next graphic gives you a nice visual of what's happening with the crop over the marketing season. The blue vertical bars represent the beginning supply for each crop year. The 4 horizontal lines represent the 4 quarterly stock estimates we published during the season. Now, for this particular chart, the green line at the top represents the September quarter. Now, looking at the beginning supply of 2.84 billion bushels, that is up 6% from the previous season and is the highest level since the 2020-21 season. And the June to August disappearance of 715 million bushels is up 4.7% from the same period a year earlier. Now, looking at how all wheat stocks compare with published expectations, you can see it is within the range, but again, higher than most had anticipated. All right, next we'll look at September 1 corn stocks, which, as you know, represents the 4th quarter or ending stocks quarter of the marketing year. As of September 1st, total stocks are estimated at 1.53 billion bushels. That is down 13.1% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks are down 17.6% from the previous September, while off-farm stocks are down 9.6%. Now, this chart is very similar to the one we looked at earlier for wheat, but now that green line, which represents September, is at the bottom of the chart instead of the top, since this is the ending stocks quarter for corn. The beginning supply of corn for the 24-25 crop year was 16.7 billion bushels. I do want to point out that because of rounding on this chart, that looks to be equal to the previous year. However, it is 0.3% lower than the 23-24 beginning supply. Now, the June to August disappearance of 3.11 billion bushels is down 3.8% from the same period a year earlier. All right, today's corn stock estimates look to be a surprise since they came in above the range of expectations. As I mentioned at the beginning of the briefing, now that the marketing year for corn and soybeans is finished, we did a thorough review of the balance sheets to determine if revisions to acreage yield and production needed to be made to the 2024 crop. Now, this slide is showing the 2024 corn balance sheet for the U.S. Now, if you look at the column on the left titled Previous Estimates, the September 2024 beginning stocks number and the 2024 production number are previously published NASS estimates. Now, all the other numbers in that column that have an asterisk beside them came directly from the September WASDE report that was published earlier this month. Now, in that middle column titled September 30th estimates, We show the revisions we made to the previous NASS estimates and simply pull forward the WASDE numbers for the purposes of this balance sheet, since they are the most recent published estimates we have. We also know that they could change when the next WASDE comes out on October 9th. And then on that far right column, you can see how the September 30th estimates compared to the previous estimates. Now, as I mentioned earlier, corn production was raised 25 million bushels from what we previously estimated. This change was acreage driven based on the most recent farm program administrative data we have for 2024. Now, the ending stock estimate we published today at 1.53 billion bushels is 207 million bushels more than what was in the September WASDE report. And then if you look at that calculated residual, again, based on the production revisions we made and the most recent published usage data, it's 182 million bushels below what was published in the September WASDE. But again, we'll see how that changes when the next WASDE report comes out. All right, next we'll look at the September soybean stocks, which like corn represents the ending stock quarter of the marketing year. Now, as of September 1st, total stocks are estimated at 316 million bushels. This is down 7.6% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks are down 17.7% from the previous September, while off-farm stocks are down 2.7%. Now, the beginning supply of soybeans for the 24-25 crop year at 4.72 billion bushels was up 6.6% from the prior season. And then the June to August disappearance of 691 million bushels is up 10.1% from the same period last year. Now, unlike corn, the soybean stock estimates should not be much of a surprise since that falls within the range of expectations. All right, looking at the 2024 soybean balance sheet for the U.S., this table is laid out the same as corn with the previous NASS estimates and revisions as of September 30th, along with the most recent published WASDE estimates. As you can see in the far right-hand column, production was raised just 8 million bushels. And again, that was acreage driven based on the most current administrative data we have from 2024. The ending stocks total of 316 million bushels is 14 million less than was published in the September WASDE, and then that calculated residual based on the current published estimates would be 21 million bushels higher than what was published in the most recent WASDE, but again, that is subject to change when the next WASDE report comes out. All right, take a quick look at some of the other commodities in today's grain stocks report. September barley stocks at 150 million bushels are down 2.6% from the same time last year. Durum wheat stocks at 71.1 million bushels are up 5.7% from last September. September oat stocks at 67.5 million bushels are up 3.4% from the same time last year. Safflower stocks at 11.5 million pounds are down 15.4% compared to a year earlier. However, despite the drop from 2024, this is still the second highest September total since 2017. Sorghum stocks at 40 million bushels are up 22.4% from the same time last year. And lastly, sunflower stocks at 209 million pounds are down 63.4% from the same time last year. And this is the lowest September total since 2020. All right, this slide just highlights a few of the upcoming reports we will be releasing in October. Tomorrow we'll be releasing our CARES report. October 9th, we'll come back for another crop production report as well as a cotton ginnings. October 24th, we'll be releasing cattle on feed. And then the last day of the month, we'll be releasing our 10-year ownership and transition of agricultural land, also referred to as total, as well as the agricultural prices report. Now, as a reminder, on October 21st, we will be having our USDA Fall Data Users Meeting in West Des Moines, Iowa, to share recent and pending statistical program changes with the public. Now, this will be a hybrid event, and those interested in attending either in person or virtually can register at the link on this slide or on the NASS website. And as mentioned earlier, Lance will be on X at 1:30 today for Stat Chat, answering any questions about the numbers in today's reports. So that concludes the 2025 Small Grain Summary and September Grain Stocks Briefing. And as a reminder, today's report and all NASS reports can be found on the NASS website. So again, I want to thank those who joined us here in person today, as well as those who joined in on